All right, welcome back. Here we are with another new set of lectures. This time it's going to be on the material that in the second edition is chapter 16, but I think in the third edition it's going to be chapter 15. At any rate, managing state. I'm not going to cover everything that's going to be in this chapter. I'm just going to cover the stuff that we need to know for our Web 2 class, the Comp 3512. So let's get going. Come on. There we go. So we're going to look at four sorts of topics. We're going to begin introducing what is state and why is it a problem, or why do we have to worry about managing it in web applications. We're then going to look at the two ways that we deal with state in web applications, query strings and cookies. And then we'll look at a kind of a more sophisticated way that we can work with state called sessions or session state. And we'll find that this is going to be stuff that you'll need to know for your second assignment. All right, what's state? State in this context basically means the data that's in memory used by an application as it executes. Like in a desktop application, that's not really an issue, right? Your program is running in memory, and all parts of your program have access to that memory. But in a web application, things are a little different. As it says here, state management is an issue since a web application on a server only really exists while it's handling a request. Oh, what does that mean exactly? Well, let's take a look at this last point. The application experience for a user must be spread across multiple requests in a web application. Well, let's see what that actually means in principle. A web server gets requests. It deals with requests. So in some ways, from a web server's perspective, two requests from one user is really no different than getting those two requests from two different users. There's no real difference as far as the web server is concerned. But that's a real problem because what, of course, the user wants is it wants the server to know that these two requests are coming from the same user. So how do we do this? Well, let's take a look at another example. Let's take a look here at, let's say, how a login might work. So let's imagine some user makes a request for a page, let's say portfolio.php, and the server somehow knows that the user of this request is not logged in, and instead of giving it the portfolio page, it gives it the login form. So the user signs in, right? They fill in their login information, they click send, and so the server maybe says, yep, this is a valid user, and then sends back the appropriate page, right? In this particular case, let's call it signedin.php. And in this signedin.php, maybe there's a link to view the portfolio. Remember this page up here. So they click on it, and this time the server knows the user of this request is logged in and thus responds with the appropriate user portfolio. Well, the big question is, how does the server know that the first request wasn't valid, but this one is? Well, this is what state is all about, and that's what we're going to look at. So how did the server know? Well, there's really only two possibilities. There's actually a third around logins, which we'll worry about later on in the security section. But by and large, there's two possibilities. And we're limited to what HTTP gives us. And HTTP gives us query strings, and it gives us cookies. And we have to, and that's it. That's what we're limited to. That's what we have to work with it. So let's take a look at query strings. Well, we've already looked at query strings earlier with PHP. Remember that there was get and post, right, with get requests. The query string information is part of the URL. With post requests, the query string is there inside of the HTTP header. As you've already kind of discovered with your PHP already, dynamic URLs, in other words, query strings, are a pretty essential part of web application development. I do want to let you know, however, that many websites actually rewrite their URLs so that they're not using query strings. They still have that query string information, but it's packaged inside of the static URLs. What does this mean? Well, for instance, here's here's a query string, right? Everything after the $, right? We've got, the question mark, and here we clearly have some query string information. But look at these URLs. It looks like they've packaged the query string data for their sites inside of the URL. Why have they done this? Well, there's a perception that search engines prefer or give better rankings to sites when they don't use query strings. Indeed, this little example here from the book seems to indicate that, indeed. The ones with URL rewriting seem to have done better. So there's ways of doing this in Apache and Linux, which we don't need to worry about. All right, but query strings, whether it's that data is in the URL or it's at the end of the URL or it's in the HTTP header, is one of the two key ways of passing information. The other key way is via cookies. So what are cookies? Well, they're a client-side approach to persisting state information. So it's information that's stored on the browser. Their name equals value pairs. They can be saved within text files, which are managed by the browser. Cookie values are associated with a domain or site. So the idea is that domain A can't access cookies from domain B. Cookie values travel within the HTTP header. So how do they work? Well, this is important. I would expect you to know this. So let's take a look at this example. Here a user makes the first request, their very first request to a page in, let's say, a domain called some site. So they're asking for some page from some site. The page sets cookie values as part of the response, and the HTTP response contains these cookie values that were set in the header. You can see there's a HTTP header called set cookie. They're just a series of name equals value pairs. There may be expiry dates, and that ends up traveling to the browser. The browser, if there's an expiry, will save the cookie values in its own text file and associate them with this domain. Sometime in the future, the user makes another request for a page from that same domain. The browser will then read that cookie value from the text file, and it will travel inside the HTTP request to that server. So you can see these cookie values travel in the cookie header, the cookie response header. The server can then retrieve those cookie values from the request header and then use them to customize the response. That's how cookies work. It's really, I think it's essential that you understand all the steps in this process. There's two types of cookies. There's session cookies and persistent cookies. On the previous slides, we were looking at a persistent cookie, a cookie that is preserved in the cookie store in the browser, and that happens because an expiry date was provided. If no expiry date is provided, then it's just that cookie exists only until the end of the user browser session. So often that's how logins are implemented, is via session cookies. Well, how do we set a cookie in PHP? Well, there's a function for it called setCookie where we can specify a name, a value, expiry time, and in fact there's a variety of other parameters that we can set. How about reading a cookie? Well, you can see that there's a super global array, $_cookie that we can use. We always should check to make sure it exists first, and then we can retrieve it. Interestingly, we're not actually going to use cookies in our assignment. What we're going to use instead is a kind of souped up cookie called sessions. So what is session state? Well, most server-based web applications need some kind of mechanism for associating server data with user requests. All modern server-based web applications provide sessions as a way of doing this. ASP was one of the, I believe, was the very first environment that provided session state, and then every other one since then has made use of it. So what is session state? Well, as it says here, it's a server-based state mechanism that lets web applications store and retrieve objects of any type for each unique user session. It implements session state as follows. Each browser session has its own session state stored as a serialized file on the server, which is then deserialized and loaded into memory as needed by PHP for each request. So what that means is whatever your memory object is will get turned into a text file, and then PHP figures out and when comes a new request comes in from a user it recognizes, it will read that session file and turn it back into a memory object that page can access. We'll look at a picture, an image of that shortly. It is important to note that session state will time out after about 20 or 30 minutes of inactivity. So here's a key point. Session state is temporary, right? It's only going to, it might not exist. How does it, think of it like this, right? We've got 3 different users accessing with our web application, and maybe they've got shopping carts, and these shopping carts only exist temporarily for the user. Well, each of these user sessions has a serialized file that's managed by the server, managed by PHP. And so whatever information you want to store in that shopping cart is saved inside of this file. And PHP kind of works with putting stuff into there, like writing the file and reading the file. You don't have to worry about any of that as a developer. How do we work with it? It's actually pretty straightforward. First off, we need this session_start function call, and it's got to happen at the top of the page before any markup is output or is echoed. Okay, so that's absolutely essential. The $_session is just another super global array. You can specify any key name. And because session data can time out after 20 minutes, it might not exist. So you always have to check first to make sure it exists before you try accessing it. Okay. So for instance, in this example here, right, we're starting the session, we're checking if it exists, and if it doesn't exist, then we initialize it. In this particular case, maybe we've got a list of favorites, maybe favorite movies, for instance. And so maybe that list of favorites is just going to be an array. So if that favorites doesn't exist, so maybe this is the first time this person has gone into this site, or their previous session timed out, we want to initialize it to an empty array, and then say right, and then we can retrieve that. Right. Well, how does it work behind the scenes? Well, how does it work behind the scenes is via cookies. Remember, we're limited to either query strings or cookies. So PHP uses cookies. And what it does is it uses something called a session ID, which is, you could think of it as like a big kind of random 32 character string of numbers and letters. Each user session will have its own session ID associated with it. That session ID is what passes back and forth via cookies. So the shopping cart doesn't go back and forth between the user. The session ID goes back and forth between the user. All right, well, let's take a look and implement a little favorites list. So maybe we've got some file, let's call it list.php, which, I don't know, maybe displays a list of movies or a list of products or what have you. And maybe we've got the ability to view that product or view that movie, and we do that maybe via maybe the movie ID or the product ID or something like that. Well, maybe we've also got an add to favorites. And you can see here, okay, we're going to implement this add to favorites, and we'll have to pass the product number ID or movie ID or whatever it is that we're doing. So you can imagine in a list of movies, right, different movies are going to have different IDs and so on. Maybe in the details page, we've also got the ability to add, let's say a particular movie to our favorites list as well. And so once again, so you can see we're passing in the ID. So let's see what this add to favorites actually looks like. It's actually remarkably simple. It's just, it's less than 10 lines of code. We have to, of course, start the session. We then have to check to make sure see if it exists. If it doesn't exist, we have to initialize our sessions as maybe just an array, an empty array. We'll then retrieve whatever was there. It'll either be empty, or if it already exists, we'll get whatever is currently there. We're going to retrieve from the query string. Remember the ID of, let's say the movie ID was passed into us. So we're just going to add that to the end of our array. We then resave our modified list back to session state. And then we'll probably need to redirect somewhere. Here I'm redirecting back to the page that requested us. Alternatively, we could maybe redirect to a view favorites page or something like that. Look at that, there's no markup in this page. It just does something. And that's it. That's actually all you need to do to implement a favorites list. Though strangely, students find a way to not be able to do this every year. I hope this year will be different. I think that's it. Oh, I forgot the numbers. But I think that's it. That's Session Management 101.